Welcome to the SIDMA tutorial series, funded by EPA Region 5 and the Great Lakes Regional Water Program. In this tutorial, you'll learn how to analyze response data in SIDMA. Specifically, we will view response frequency data and view indicator scores. In order to better view SIDMA's analytical functions for response data, we need to look at a project with pre- and post-surveys, and a large number of responses recorded for those surveys. The demo project we have been working with for the previous tutorials does not have a sufficient number of responses recorded. So for this tutorial, we'll work with an existing project that does meet this criteria. We want to find the Spring-Fed Creek project in Wisconsin. On the project page, select Wisconsin as a state filter and then open the Spring-Fed Creek project. This project has a pre- and post-survey, each with 350 responses present. Let's start with the pre-survey. Under Results and Analysis, select View Response Frequencies. It might take a few seconds to crunch the results, but once SIDMA is finished, we are presented with a view of the survey with response data for each question. Let's take a look at the first category, Rating for Water Quality. The numbers under the response options represent the percentage of respondents that selected each option. For question 1, 4% of respondents rated the water in their area as poor for boating, whereas 49.1% rated it as good. The numbers under the response items represent the numeric value associated with each response item in SIDMA's database. A response that selected poor was stored as 1, okay, 2, good, 3, and don't know, 9. These values were utilized to estimate the mean value and standard deviation across all of the respondents for this question, and are presented to the right of the response frequencies. The total number of responses to this question and what SIDMA deems a valid response are also listed. The total response number represents the number of respondents who provided an answer to the question, meaning they didn't leave a blank. The valid response number represents the number of respondents that did not select I don't know as an option. The valid response number is what SIDMA utilized in the calculation of the mean and standard deviation. Note the up and down arrows under the columns in the table. For table-type questions, results can be sorted by column. For example, clicking on the down arrow under Poor will sort the activities from those rated poorest to least poor. Clicking on the up arrow under Standard Deviation will sort the activities from those where responses were least variable to most variable. Also, note that the text of each question is hyperlinked. Click on it to view a graphical representation of the results. This is an image that can be copied and pasted into another document or report. At the lower right-hand portion of this window, there is another link which displays the results as a bar chart. Let's take a look at the About You category. The independent questions, meaning non-table questions, cannot be sorted like a table, and mean and standard deviation data is not presented for most. But for radio and checkbox questions, frequency data is listed for each option, and clicking on the text of these questions presents a graphical output. For text response questions that are numeric, such as question 3, statistics are provided, and clicking on the question text opens up a histogram. The bins of the histogram represent equal intervals. The number of intervals, or bins, can be specified at the left. Also, the individual response link lists each response and its corresponding response ID. This could be useful in tracking down possible errant responses. For example, if the statistics for this question reported a max value of 1,950, we might infer that the respondent put the year they were born instead of their age. We could use this listing to identify the respondent and delete the response if necessary. Now we'll cover text response questions that are non-numeric, such as the open comments question at the end of the survey. Clicking on the question would list the responses by response ID, just like we saw with the age question. But here we see that no one provided a comment, as is their right. That shows how to review response frequency data for a particular SIDMA survey. Now let's look at the survey's indicator scores. Under Results and Analysis, click on View Indicator Scores. We are presented with a listing of the indicators described in the introduction tutorial and in detail in the Social Indicators Handbook, accessible under the About tab. The general indicators are broken down into smaller indicators. Attitudes is measured through two sub-indicators: general water quality attitudes and willingness to take action. The indicator score itself is represented by the mean score reported for each sub-indicator. Let's take a closer look at what is being reported for the general water quality attitudes indicator. According to the range description, following the indicator, where values closer to 1 represent less positive attitudes, and values closer to 5 represent more positive attitudes, a mean value of 3.86 implies that attitudes towards water quality among respondents to the pre-survey were generally positive. Recall that there were 350 total respondents to the survey, but here the number of responses is 2,450. This is because the calculation of the indicator score does not use one question from the survey to measure each respondent's attitude. A number of questions from the survey help measure attitude. Worded another way, 2,450 total answers from 350 total respondents were used to estimate this attitude indicator. To better understand how this indicator is calculated, we can click on the indicator text. We see that the General Water Quality Attitudes indicator was calculated from responses to the questions in the Your Opinions category of the survey. For some of the indicator calculations, original response values are recoded prior to the calculation. In this case, the original values are retained. Notice that at the right of the General Water Quality Attitudes indicator, there is a link to a graphical output of the indicator. We see a bar graph which shows that most responses to these attitude-related questions were a 4, or generally positive. Note that SIDMA cannot provide estimates for some indicators. For example, the capacity indicators must be measured offline. In the case of Indicator 4.2, SIDMA does not include functionality to report available funding for non-point source pollution reduction practices in critical areas. Let's take a closer look at the awareness indicator. Awareness is represented by 4 sub-indicators, but on this survey only sub-indicator 1.4 has a reported value. We see that the other 3 cannot be reported because the survey's key questions have not yet been identified. These indicators are only calculated on survey's key awareness questions. Once these have been identified, as demonstrated in the previous tutorial, SIDMA will report indicator scores for these sub-indicators. For now, let's focus on 1.4. This sub-indicator measures respondents' awareness of appropriate practices to improve water quality. Compared to our previous example, it has a smaller range, with values closer to 1 representing less awareness, and values closer to 2 representing more awareness. The mean value of 1.8 implies that awareness was high among the pre-survey respondents. Let's click on the indicator text to see how it was calculated. The calculation of this indicator is more complex than the attitudes indicator we saw previously. Questions from 2 categories are utilized in the calculation. Specifically, all of the questions in the Practices to Improve Water Quality category, and the first question from each subsection of the Specific Constraints of Practices category. We see how the original response scores are recoded in order to calculate an indicator value between 1 and 2. If a respondent knows how to use a practice, or is currently using it, the response is coded as a 2. If they are only somewhat familiar, their response is coded as a 1.5. Whereas if they've never heard of it, their response is coded as a 1. If the respondent indicates that the practice isn't relevant, the answer is not factored into the calculation. We see in the description below that 2 means are used in the calculation of this indicator. Mean 1 represents the average indicator score among responses to the Practices to Improve Water Quality category's questions, whereas mean 2 represents the average indicator score among responses to specific constraints. The final indicator calculation is a weighted average between those 2 means, with 60% of the score coming from mean 2 and 40% from mean 1. This weighting is used because the selection of practices for inclusion in the specific constraints category implies that these practices are of greater importance and significance to the project area, and therefore the assessment of awareness for them is also more important. As you analyze indicator scores on your survey, you should take the time to review how each indicator score was calculated, as this will inform the conclusions you draw from the results. In this tutorial, we reviewed how to view and analyze response data to a SIDMA survey and from a SIDMA survey, and also learned how various indicator scores are calculated by SIDMA. In the next tutorial, we'll describe how to compare response data between two surveys.